Hello, everyone, and welcome back. For week two, we're going to be picking up the idea of the social self and identification. It's a very interesting topic this week, and we are getting into something that is characteristically challenging about psychology, which is that what we want to study is not exactly right under our nose. We are going to be dealing with abstract terms that I think will have a lot of common sense value to them, but it's going to require critical thinking, meaning that it might not mean exactly what we think, or if it seems, let's say, totally out of the ballpark or unrelatable, it might actually be more relatable than it initially appears once we think about it more. And, this critical thinking that we're going to have to do means that, the easy interpretation is not exactly the last interpretation we're going to end up with. So we're talking about what it means to identify with something. And so, in this way, right, the person is more than the person appears. So, for example, people might identify with other people in their life, family or friends, meaning that there sort of is an extension of the self and, an extension of emotional energy, beyond the individual into these other folks around us. To some extent, this might mean that if something happens to a friend or a family member, it feels as if it's happening to me. People might also identify with, ideals, something a little bit more abstract, like freedom, equality, justice, love, ideals of the market, such as free trade. People identify also with what we could call ideologies, a Republican ideology, a Democratic ideology, socialist or social democrat, etc. People might also identify with social groups, such as, just cliques in the most basic sense, a high school sense. People might identify with their profession. Some people might identify with a race. They might identify with a religion or a nationality. Now, as we're making sense of this all, we can revisit Aristotle and Aristotle's concept of identification, which is this equation A equals A. What he's saying here is that each thing is the same as itself and different from other things. Therefore, a thing is relatively stable and worth studying over time. So this is, maybe deceptively simple. There may be a question of, so what's the punchline here? What's the point of this? Well, what what if we didn't believe that things in the world were stable? What if we believed in, magical events or, the commonplace occurrence of miracles where, this lake, you know, down the street from your house might be made of water one day and might be made of wine or whiskey the next day. Whether or not someone believes in miracles, per se is not exactly the point, but that, with this Aristotelian idea of identity, which is that it's one thing one day, it's probably going to be one thing the next moment, we, have to adopt a certain sobriety of mindset and maybe even a trust in our five senses. So if we're saying that one thing is itself and that it's relatively stable, that means that, aside from the ways that animals may grow, plants may grow, that there is a development, that the development is happening to a single organism. And in able to learn about what an organism is or what an object is, we might want to study that object. We might want to also study objects that are, almost exactly like that object. And then we're going to start to make generalizations about the topic that we're being studied. So we're kind of saying, like, well, you are you, you are not someone else. And this is, actually the foundational assumption of empiricism, right? Empiricism being the study of observable data. the study of things that can be shown to anyone and repeated. This would be a great time to watch the brief video about Aristotle that I posted right under the module for week 2. You can't miss it. It's not that long. My recommendation is just to pause this video, go watch the Aristotle video, and then come on back, or however you want to do it. Keeping going, though, with this concept of identification, and remember, we're starting to not just think about, what an identity is external to us, but we're also thinking about, this concept of identity as something that is kind of holistic, that has a conceptual or a cognitive dimension. It also has a social dimension, which means that to some extent, we, as I said earlier, extend ourselves into others in an abstract sense. Most obvious example being that if your sports team that you love loses, you're going to feel some sense of loss personally. A little bit more about that later. Well, let's remember this. Since everything in nature, in the natural world, is unique, meaning if we really get down to the, atomic level, there's going to be some differences, no matter what, okay? So in the sense of all of this, pervasive uniqueness, certain general facts do jump out to us, right? Even though every cat may be different, there still is kind of a thing that we want to classify that's called cats, and that's where biology comes in with all of the different Latinized categorizations. But to understand what something really is, we might need to make a number of comparisons and sort of synthesize and draw together these comparisons and generalize from our comparisons. So this might mean that if we want to understand ourselves, we also need to obtain some general information about the human species, about human beings. Because, as is often the case, right? On the topic of self-exploration, we might change the way we see ourselves, and by talking to other people in our life, especially with, kind of critical discussions that try to get down to the truth, we end up learning something about ourselves as a result of learning about others. We say, oh yeah, that's me, I'm like that. That's the process of learning we're talking about here. So for example, to learn about the common struggles of athletes, if we're doing something like, sports psychology, we're going to need to study athletic performance. We're going to leave, the comfort of our own home or office, and we might go talk to real athletes. Identification, again, a deceptively simple idea, says that, things are going to ring a bell. It's going to, sound like me when we learn this general information about other people. And when something, that sounds like me, it then, raises a question. And when a question is raised about the nature of knowledge, we might want to think more about it, think critically or write to pursue that question, or we might want to talk with someone else, whether that's a friend, an elder, a spouse, a therapist, any of these things. That, this process of self-exploration and comparison, learning about identity, is something that, takes on more vitality and power when we bring other people into the process. And, that's exactly what Aristotle believed. How can we use Aristotle's ideas about identification to think about the idea of self-concept? Well, what do we mean by self-concept? Basically, this is the total of an individual's beliefs about his or her own personal attributes, as it all sort of adds up as we summarize it all. We could also think about the idea of a gestalt, which is a concept that says that sometimes things are more than the sum of their parts, right? Meaning that, the human being has 5 senses of seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and touching. But what if we can do all of those things? Of course, people can do all of those things, right? Having access to all of these senses might give us the ability to look at things from different angles, or understand that just because something looks one way, like if we have, a piece of fruit that is, a normal piece of fruit, let's say an apple, and then if we have another piece of fruit that was maybe made out of, I don't know, chalk and painted, or made out of soap, it's going to taste different, it's going to smell different. So having these different senses, like, already raises a question of doubt about a single sense. And so this is why, a gestalt, or something being more than the total sum of the parts, is also important to talk about when we look at the self in a more mathematical way. So we could look at the sum of attributes, or we could sort of look at a gestalt of attributes. And when we talk about the self, well, we're talking about the body, we're talking about memories, we're talking about, religious texts, religious ideology, political beliefs, morals, all of these things, art, all of these things. It kind of just comes together in this really complicated way. It's not just one of these things. And so if we think of the idea of A versus A, that, basically you are you're not someone else. And there's a certain enduringness to that, even allowing for change and growth, that, even within the A, there's going to be a host of different variables that sort of either will add up, or maybe sort of vibe with each other in an interesting way. Another idea for thinking about identity and selfhood, and we're starting to break this up now, as I had just said, getting into the different pieces within, that identity. The self schema, this is how we think about ourselves. It's a belief people hold about themselves. It guides the processing of self-relevant information. What's an example of this? Someone grows up and, they're told they're not good at math. Probably many people here could relate to that. That's going to affect the way that you relate to math homework or a math book. It's going to be scary. It's going to maybe be intimidating or boring. You're going to not bother to try. And, we could also look at this for sports or reading or any number of things that, as people are told about who they are or what they can do, it becomes solidified through memory and through language, through words. So in other words, self-knowledge, filters out information which may be relevant to our self-concept. Some people may not even notice what might be very important to you. Let's say if someone identifies as, a hardcore hockey fan, they might notice sort of an obscure jersey that someone's wearing and really notice it and never forget it practically, right? Where someone else sees that jersey, they might just think, oh, whatever, it's a black and yellow jersey, who knows what that even was, and they just totally forget it. So this is to say that what we say about ourselves and what we notice about ourselves absolutely impacts what we notice about the broader world. So an interesting question is, do non-human animals show self-recognition? And we can look at this study by Gordon Gallup from actually 1977. That's on page 57 of our text. Feel free to pull out your text if you'd like right now. And we have a video also that explains this, where it looks at, non-human primates and, the phenomena of the mirror. Can animals make something of their reflection? Do they kind of put two and two together and say, oh yeah, maybe that's me, maybe that's this body? So clearly we know, right, that, humans, Homo sapiens, compared to other primates, we have this large developed prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for, abstract thinking, for kind of resisting obvious, intuitive, even magical thinking notions. So, we do know that humans have more capacity for abstraction, but, we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that there's nothing at all like a self in other primates even. Great time to check out this video, and if you want to pause this and come back, could be a good idea. Moving on, however, we're going to start to look at another aspect of the self, which is how it seems to project itself into the future. This is called affective forecasting. Obvious example is that we are all aware of our own mortality. And there's a certain feeling to that. That means that there's a certain need to make the most of the moment, or if we're not making the most of a moment, there might be something concerning about that, or something depressing, a sense that time is just flying by. And there maybe is a certain heaviness or responsibility that comes with knowledge of our own mortality. Um, we could think of other less grave examples too, though. If you know that you're going on vacation the week after this, hopefully someone in this class is, your week may actually feel a little bit different when you wake up in the morning and go through your day knowing that it's not going to go on and on as it is this way forever, but you're going to have a break next week. That sometimes imparts a certain feeling. Right, taxes are due pretty shortly. And so for people who maybe haven't done their taxes yet, there just is something kind of hanging over you in a way, in an intuitive way. You may feel it in your gut or another part of your body. And then when you get your taxes done, you may feel like a weight has been lifted. So this idea of affective forecasting predicts how we would feel in response to future emotional events. This is really interesting when we think of something like, let's say, a phobia. Someone has a driving phobia or a phobia of dogs or cats. And, part of treatment is pointing out to people, in addition to maybe setting up some kind of exposures where you have to interact with these, feared stimuli, always in an orderly way. Meaning you don't just want to go in and sort of stress yourself out. You have to be aware that this is a process and that one success builds on top of another. But with phobias, people, very consistently will overestimate how scary their encounter with the phobic object will be. So, when I'm doing treatment for clients on, let's say, a driving phobia, first we decide what the driving task is going to be, maybe starting easy, driving around driving around the block or driving around the parking lot. First you rate before you get into the car. Okay, scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this going to be? Someone might say a 6 or a 7. And then afterwards, it turns out it was only maybe a 4 or a 5. This is an example of affective forecasting and how it does synthesize and kind of summarize a lot of information, and yet, it's intuitive, meaning that it's not necessarily precise, and that it might be too much under the sway of, we could say primitive drives, such as fear. Our authors, right, in our Casson, Fine, and Marcus text say that affective forecasting is a type of introspection, meaning that it's a way that we will think about and sort of delve into ourselves. Adjacent to this idea, right, as we're now starting to think about looking inward and how there's a process of emotion and of thought that starts to, mingle. We can think about this idea of self-consciousness in a general sense. Public and private self-consciousness are said to be two different types. So individuals may be high in private self-consciousness and or public self-consciousness, but what are these two things? Private self-consciousness. This is a personality characteristic of an individual who is introspective and attends to their own inner state. There's been research that shows people high in private self-consciousness might tend to not only think a lot about themselves or how they fit in with situations, but, they might actually react more quickly to, cognitive latency-based response tests regarding self-focused pronouns. I'll explain what that means, okay? And this was actually some of the very first research that I did back when I was an undergrad. And what I did in this study, this is way back. This is like the early 2000s, and just became a poster that we did at the the local college undergraduate research event. But what I did for this was we took this little app that, or it wasn't an app back then, but sort of a little program that's a number, a square about maybe a foot by a foot, and we have a random jumble of numbers flashing, and then every few seconds, every 10 seconds, it varied. A word that was self-referential would show up, such as me, myself, I, that type of thing. and when you see a word, you have to hit the space bar. So, but we gave people other words too, besides the self-referential pronouns. We would just have normal words, such as car, basket, wheelbarrow, hamburger, something like that. And what we actually found, and this is what the data finds as well, that individuals who were high in private self-consciousness, as assessed by a self-report measure, actually responded particularly quickly to the self-referential pronouns. So this just means, there's kind of something there, that people's processing is geared towards certain types of data. Public self-consciousness is a different variable, different type of self-consciousness. This is a personality characteristics of individuals who focus on themselves as social objects, very self-conscious in terms of how are they viewed. Research has shown that people high in this latter variable are more likely to look at mirrors when they're walking by them. If you're walking through a store, there's a mirror over in the wall, maybe you look at it, maybe you ignore it. Someone who is high in public self-consciousness might be more likely. Doesn't mean they're the only ones who will do it, or if you do it, that's you. But, people high in public self-consciousness might be more likely to look at that mirror and just kind of size themselves up and think about how they look. Basically what early literature had found on these variables is that they can actually be helpful to think about yourself as, one who is an individual unit, or to think of yourself as someone who's part of a group. Both of these can be really helpful if it is done in a time-limited way, if it's done in a focused way, and if it's not just something that goes on and on forever. Because if it goes on and on forever, it just kind of becomes like this dreamlike haze, possibly of some sort of social anxiety. We have an interesting account of self-perception in the work of Bem. This is on page 60. This is self-perception theory. Getting into one of the Canvas discussion board posts with this topic. So to the extent that people have internal states that are faint, subtle, fleeting, or difficult to interpret, people have to make educated guesses about, what they in reality think or feel. Right? Like, am I anxious or am I excited? How do you tell? Am I sick or am I just anxious? How do you tell? It can be hard to know ourselves, and so Bem says that people infer actually what they think or feel by observing their own behavior and the situation in which that behavior takes place. So, someone kind of feels funny and they're rushing around and they're dropping things, forgetting things. They may say, oh, geez, I'm a mess today. That's an example of this. So, basically internal cues are difficult to interpret. So people gain self-insight, we would hope, by observing what they do in these particular situations. Of course, this gets into social comparison theory, which says that, we learn about ourselves and our abilities by comparing them to others. Right? Erik Erikson says that, at a certain early point in development, right, basically early school years, there's a conflict that people face called industry versus inferiority, meaning that as you compare yourself to other people, you're going to get a sense on if you're, industrious, if you can do it, get it done, if you're effective when it comes to discharging tasks, or if you're not as good as other people. And so Erikson says that if someone doesn't do well in that particular, challenge, then they might actually have trouble with other social challenges later in life. I'll say one more thing about the self-perception theory and this idea that internal cues are often difficult to interpret. So research has shown, a lot of the research that came out of Boston University, looking at, individuals like David Barlow or Tim Brown, they actually found that individuals who were high in, different anxiety measures, okay, say, the Beck, anxiety index, something like that. The individuals high in anxiety scores from self-report measures also tended to have what was called sensitivity to interoceptive experiences, interoceptive anxiety. So what does that mean? That people who tend to have anxiety problems in general tend to be distressed by unusual physical sensations. So, this is one theory about caffeine and anxiety, that of course caffeine is a stimulant, and that's going to get your mind racing. And so there's an anxiety piece right there, but also the fact that your stomach might start to feel funny when you drink coffee. That actually is particularly scary to a lot of individuals with anxiety. One way that panic disorder is treated, that panic attacks are treated, is that the therapist, if they're doing exposure-based treatment for anxiety, they'll actually try to get the client to experience something funny that feels like a panic attack, such as breathing through a straw for a minute, spinning around in a chair, looking at a mirror for 2 minutes straight, so it starts to defamiliarize, and the individual dissociates to some extent. That feels enough like a panic attack that sometimes the individual thinks that they're having a panic attack. So this is just to say that, when we're trying to make sense of this sort of sea of stuff that's going on inside of us, we have to make comparisons to figure out what's there. This could be wrong, this could be right. And again, we could maybe see then how this gets into some of Aristotle's philosophies about identity and identification, that even to just make sure that one thing is one thing 1 minute to the next, we need to compare it to other people or other things. A few notes about culture and the self, right? That the way that people do things as families or as groups of people, as nations, as religions, as any of these things, there are customs that are passed on, there are forms of art that are passed on, there are beliefs that are passed on, and this is often what teaches people about how to be human, especially initially. We might learn this from our parents or our peers. We learn how to do things by seeing the ways that other people do things. So how does this help us think about, the following matter? Okay. On page 72, our authors talk about the difference between an independent view of the self versus a dependent view of the self. Page 72. An independent view of the self places the individual at the center of a circle, surrounded by individuals the self identifies with, looking outward. Okay? A dependent view of the self shows the individual overlapping with the individuals she identifies with, he or she or whoever identifies with. So this is a question of what is the most important thing in life. Is it you or is it the group? So we might look then at the distinction between, an individualist versus a collectivist notion of the self. On page 63, we can get into a little more on this, about the self-perception of emotions, and what do we make of that? Because people often have feelings about emotions, meaning, I feel this way, I'm a mess, or hey, I'm on top of it, I'm feeling great, good for me. It could get very rich, very culturated. It needs to be decoded at that point. Another point of comparison is what's called the two-factor theory of emotions. That's on page 68. This is the theory that the experience of emotion is based on two factors: physiological arousal and a cognitive interpretation of this arousal. So we can already see this as we're talking about the interoceptive sensitivity. You feel a certain way and you kind of make a judgment about what it is or what's going on, but there's like a body thing going on, and there's sort of this narrative that we have about what that is. One of the first things for treating panic disorder that's so helpful is just letting people know that the physical symptoms of anxiety, what they really are. It doesn't mean you're dying. It doesn't mean you're poisoned. It doesn't mean you're going crazy. It probably just means you're having a fight or flight response. Okay, and that the stomach and digestion is going to slow down. Blood is going to flow to the large muscle groups. It might go away from your head. You might have a hard time thinking abstractly or doing math problems, for example, when you're stressed. You might sort of feel short of breath. You might feel cold or clammy or sweaty. These are a fight or flight response, and you have to tell people what this stuff is, so then they also know what it is not, and they know that it will go away in time. We'll get a little bit into William James, who had basically an interesting theory of emotion in that way. Okay, let's think about this idea of the sports team and the self as it relates to sports. There's an interesting study on page 92 that's called Basking in Reflective Glory. reflected glory. Our authors use this concept as a way of discussing how self-concept is influenced by the individuals and groups that we identify with. Research by Cialdini, that's from 1976, found that college students were more likely to wear a shirt with their school's name on it on a Monday morning if their school team won that weekend. So the team wins, and people are going to want to like put it on. They're going to want to remember that win, and to some extent maybe they get to join in by wearing that shirt or piece of merchandise. Now, when we also look at a social role, so this could be a fan, for one example, just to make a direct comparison. But it also could be, mother, father, brother, sister, boss, soldier, officer, professional, you really could go on. And how this, of course, relates to self-concept and, reflection on ourselves. We think about who we are, and then that influences how we feel. We like who we are, we feel good. We don't like who we are in some way, we feel bad in that moment. An interesting philosopher named G.W.F. Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, early 1800s writer, who was very influential in terms of theory to someone like Freud, who we'll get into later in the class because Freud tends to be pretty complicated. Hegel says that to identify with a social role in a reflective manner is to identify with a social role as a self. Meaning that if you're a self and that you're in a social role, you're going to be self-aware. You're a person as part of a group. You're not just a pet or an appendage or an accessory. You're a self. So he's kind of wanting to puff up this idea of a self a little bit. He wants to humanize it and says, well, given the richness of this idea of a self, what is kind of more self-like, what is less self-like? It means you're part of a group, but you have some space to be an individual, even in a very group-centered, identity. Even in something like the military, which tends to be very collectivistic in its orientation, in which, the group has a, absolute, a certain primacy over just what one person is doing. You have a certain responsibility and fullness of spirit for the group. Okay, they're still an individual. They're still an individual who has value, and even just thinking of the price tag, of a single soldier, a single officer, right? Even if the group has a certain primacy, the individual parts of the group are still very, very valuable. Identifying with others in a non-reflective manner means that you don't really count as a self, Hegel says. Okay, at least in your own mind. Right? Someone might go to see a therapist, and the therapist, or a loved one, or a mentor might say, no, there's so much more that you have to offer, or so much more than you've done, and that might need to be reinforced externally. But Hegel's saying that if you're just kind of following a group and not really thinking, just kind of getting knocked around, and what you think and feel and do is kind of just showing more about the outside world than showing something about you. What's determining you? What is sending you one way versus another? There may be a lack of determination from within, which is what Hegel wanted to see for a self. Interaction with the group and meaning of the self from the group, but then determination from within in a self-aware and integrated manner. To make this a little more complicated, Hegel also says that an individual's greatest wish, a wish on a spiritual level, is to merge in some way with other people while also remaining an individual. Could be a great topic for us to get into at some other point. Now, we're going to say a little bit more about William James, who was a pragmatist. He was a great psychologist, president of the American Psychological Association and the American Philosophical Association at different points in the early part of this century. A lot of interesting things about William James that we can get into it at another point. But he says, what does it even mean about humanity that we're capable of using a word like the self? And so he's taking a critical view of the self, to be clear, kind of like, what does this even mean? This idea of the self, it's so saturated with all this pretentious substance and association, putting on so much airs to talk about the self, self-esteem, self-determination. But he's not just totally getting rid of this idea, because he's saying, wow, that's pretty interesting if you really think about it, that human beings, just being animals who use something like language, will have this word like a self that they throw around, or maybe make such a big deal of. Is there something special or interesting about this? um, James said that the true way of viewing the self was, true meaning truth. Okay, one of many ways to view the self. A lot of ways of viewing the self, but truth is going to be a way that we can arrange facts, or it's kind of like a hook that we hang different coats on. Truth is a practical way of viewing the self, he says. He has an interesting theory of emotion, where he says, emotion has an infinite number of facets to it, because we just feel this stuff and then we interpret it. So he says, you see a bear, you run from the bear, and then you look at what you're feeling and what you're doing, and you say to yourself that you are afraid. So this is a little bit different than something like Ekman's theory, of meaningful facial expressions, or of the idea of fundamental emotions like anger, disgust, happiness, fear, etc., in which people, psychologists, kind of say that all these idea of emotions, they're not cultural, they're just real, they're there, it's based in evolution. James probably believed that to some extent, but he said, but it's physical. Who's to say what it is? And we just bring so much richness to our experience through interpretation. Could be a good time to check out James's theory of the self, as we're starting to wrap up. As always, please check out the discussion boards. Be sure to get your first posts done by Tuesday night. You have until midnight. I'm sorry, Thursday night. Stuff is posted Monday, and then you have till Thursday night. Be sure to write, in caps at the bottom of your primary post, when you respond to my question, such as the one about, Bem's theory. And then you have till Sunday night to do your response posts, okay? One post per board, right? 2 posts per board, meaning, a primary post and a response post on each board. That's 4 per week, and you're going to basically get 2 grades, 1 for each board, okay? And the response posts, those are due by Sunday night, before midnight. And, also at the bottom of that post, put response post. This helps me grade what you're doing. Okay, as always, don't hesitate to email me. Please do. Look forward to hearing from you. Look forward to reading your thoughts on these discussion boards this week. Thanks very much, everyone. Hope you have a good week and that you stay well. Take care.